There is a version of British history that most people think they know. Romans, then Vikings, then Normans, a neat progression of invasions and conquests that fills school textbooks and tourism brochures, and the kind of documentary narration that makes the past feel like a series of orderly chapters. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, because the story of medieval Britain does not begin with any of those arrivals. It begins much earlier and much stranger, in a period so poorly documented and so thoroughly mythologized that historians have spent centuries arguing about what actually happened in the centuries after Rome left and before anything resembling England or Scotland or Wales existed as concepts that anyone would have recognized. The Romans withdrew their legions from Britain in stages between roughly 383 and 410 AD, and what they left behind was not a blank slate waiting to be written on by subsequent arrivals. They left behind a population of several million people who had been living under Roman administration for nearly 4 centuries, people who spoke a mixture of Latin and Brittonic languages, who had built cities and roads and bath complexes and temples, who had converted in significant numbers to Christianity, and who now had to figure out how to organize themselves politically and militarily without the institutional framework that had structured their lives for generations. The story of how they did that, and how completely they failed in certain respects, is the actual beginning of medieval Britain, and it is considerably more complicated and more interesting than the version that begins with Alfred the Great or William the Conqueror. The period between roughly 410 and 600 AD is what historians call sub-Roman Britain, and it is one of the most debated stretches of time in the entire historical record of these islands. The debate exists because the evidence is so thin. Roman Britain had been a literate, document-producing society, and the documentation essentially stops. What survives from this period is fragmentary, often contradictory, frequently written down centuries after the events it describes, and tangled up with the kind of legendary accretion that happens when a culture loses its institutional memory and starts filling the gaps with stories. This is the period that produced the legend of Arthur, not the medieval knight of Camelot and round tables, but an earlier, murkier figure, a war leader of some kind operating in a post-Roman landscape that was fracturing under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The pressures were real and they were coming from everywhere. From the east, across the North Sea, came people the Romans had called Saxons, a term that covered a range of Germanic groups from what is now northern Germany and Denmark. They had been raiding the eastern and southern coasts of Britain since at least the 3rd century, and after the Roman military withdrawal they began arriving in larger numbers and with different intentions. From the north, the Picts, who had never been fully incorporated into the Roman province, pressed southward into territories that had previously been defended by the wall and the troops that manned it. From Ireland, which the Romans had never invaded, the Scots and other Irish groups were establishing settlements and kingdoms in western Scotland and Wales. The people caught in the middle of all this pressure were the Britons, the descendants of the Romano-British population, and their response to it shaped everything that came after. What the Britons did not do, which surprises people who expect history to follow tidy patterns, was simply surrender or disappear. The idea that the Anglo-Saxon migrations wiped out or replaced the existing British population was a common assumption in 19th and early 20th century scholarship, and it has been substantially revised by genetic research conducted in the last 20 years. What that research suggests is considerably more nuanced, a picture of population mixing rather than replacement, of communities that adapted and changed and absorbed new arrivals rather than being simply overwritten by them. The language shifted, which is remarkable in itself, because languages tend to be more resilient than populations, but the people beneath the language were more continuous than the old replacement model suggested. The kingdoms that emerged from this chaotic period are some of the strangest and most fascinating political entities in British history. In the West, kingdoms like Dumnonia in what is now Devon and Cornwall, Reged in what is now Cumbria and southern Scotland, and Gwynedd in northwest Wales preserved something of the Romano-British tradition, using Latin administrative terminology, maintaining Christian institutions, and in some cases producing literate elites who wrote poetry and kept records. In the east and southeast, the incoming Anglo-Saxon groups established their own kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, Kent, and the others that would eventually consolidate into something recognizable as England. But the boundaries between these worlds were not clean lines on a map. They were zones of contact and conflict and exchange, and the people who lived in them were doing what people always do in zones of contact, which is borrow and adapt and create new things from the collision of different traditions. This is Grimvale Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video, don't miss what rises next from the darkness. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity is one of the great pivots of this period, and it is important precisely because it was not a simple story of Roman missionaries arriving and transforming a pagan population. The actual history of how Christianity spread through early medieval Britain involves multiple sources, multiple traditions, and a considerable amount of conflict between them. The Roman mission sent by Pope Gregory in 597, led by Augustine of Canterbury, is the version most people know, partly because it was well documented and partly because it produced institutional continuities that still exist. But before Augustine arrived in Kent, Christianity had already been present in Britain for centuries, maintained by the Britons through the sub-Roman period and carried to Ireland and Scotland by missionaries of whom Patrick is only the most famous. The Celtic Christian tradition that developed in Ireland and then spread back into northern Britain through figures like Columba, who founded his monastery on Iona around 563, was in several respects quite different from the Roman tradition Augustine represented, and the tension between them produced one of the most fascinating ecclesiastical disputes of the period, the controversy over how to calculate the date of Easter, which sounds trivial but was actually a proxy argument about authority, tradition, and whose version of Christianity would define the emerging English Church. The Synod of Whitby in 664 resolved that argument in favour of the Roman tradition, which meant in practice that the English Church would be oriented toward Rome rather than toward the Irish and Scottish monastic tradition. That decision had consequences that rippled forward for centuries, shaping the institutional structure of Christianity in Britain and the relationship between the English Church and the papacy in ways that would eventually produce the Reformation, which is a very long chain of consequence from an argument about the lunar calendar in a monastery in Yorkshire in the 7th century. The monasteries themselves deserve particular attention, because in early medieval Britain they were not simply religious institutions. They were the primary centres of literacy, learning, scholarship, and artistic production in a society where those things were otherwise rare. The great monasteries of Northumbria, Lindisfarne, Jarrow, Wearmouth, were places where manuscripts were produced and illuminated, where the works of classical antiquity were copied and preserved, where scholars like Bede sat down to write works of history and theology that would shape how subsequent generations understood the past. Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed around 731, is one of the foundational texts of British historiography, and it was produced in a monastery on the northeast coast of England by a man who had entered that monastery as a child and spent his entire life within its walls. The book you are effectively watching the origins of, the idea of a unified English people with a shared history and a shared Christian identity, was in significant part an invention of monastic scholarship, a story that served the institutional purposes of the Church and the political purposes of the kingdoms that patronized it. The Vikings, when they arrive in this story, tend to be treated as a disruption, an external shock that broke apart the fragile stability of early medieval Britain. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793, which most people know as the opening of the Viking Age in Britain, was certainly experienced as a catastrophe by the people who lived through it. The destruction of a major religious centre, the killing and enslaving of monks, the theft of treasures that represented generations of accumulated craftsmanship, these were real losses with real human costs. But framing the Vikings purely as destroyers misses what the evidence actually shows, which is that Scandinavian engagement with Britain was from very early on a mixture of raiding, trading, settlement, and political negotiation that produced its own complicated forms of cultural exchange. The Danelaw, the territory in northern and eastern England where Danish law and Danish customs applied following the treaties negotiated by Alfred of Wessex and the Danish leader Guthrum in the late 9th century, was not a conquered province. It was a negotiated space where Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian cultures operated in proximity and gradually blended. The place names of northern and eastern England still carry the evidence of this. Thousands of settlements whose names end in by or thorpe or thwaite, Norse elements that replaced or merged with Older English and even older Brittonic forms. The language of everyday life in the Danelaw was a contact variety, a mixture of Old English and Old Norse that was close enough in structure that speakers of each could communicate with the other, and the mutual influence of those languages on each other shaped the development of Middle English in ways that are still visible in modern speech. Alfred of Wessex, who becomes Alfred the Great in the historical tradition, is often presented as the man who saved England from the Vikings, and there is something to that, but the reality is more interesting. Alfred did fight the Danes and did negotiate with them and did consolidate Wessex as the strongest of the surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but what made him genuinely significant was not his military campaigns. It was his understanding that political power in the early medieval world required cultural legitimacy, and that cultural legitimacy required literacy, education, and a literate class capable of producing and consuming written records. Alfred translated Latin texts into Old English, established a court school, promoted the production of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is one of the most valuable sources for this entire period, and articulated a vision of Christian kingship and learned governance that defined the idea of English monarchy for centuries afterward. He was building a state in the modern sense, a political entity with institutional continuity beyond any individual ruler, and he understood that the foundation of such a state was not military but intellectual. This is Grimvale Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video, don't miss what rises next from the darkness. The consolidation of England as a single kingdom under the successors of Alfred, Aethelstan in particular, who is often described as the first true king of all England following his victories in the 920s and 930s, represents one endpoint of the story that began with the Roman withdrawal. But it is important not to let that endpoint give the preceding centuries a false sense of inevitability. England did not have to happen. The political geography of Britain could have consolidated differently, producing a dominant Northumbrian kingdom, or a lasting division between North and South, or a continued fragmentation into regional powers without any unifying concept of English identity. The fact that it consolidated the way it did, around a Wessex-based monarchy with a particular vision of Christian kingship and English national identity, was the product of specific decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances, not the inevitable working out of any deeper logic. Scotland's trajectory in this same period was equally contingent and equally fascinating. The kingdom that would become Scotland emerged from the merger of the Pictish kingdom of the north and the Irish origin kingdom of Dalriata in the west, a process traditionally associated with Kenneth MacAlpin in the mid-9th century, though the reality was considerably more gradual and more complicated than the traditional account suggests. The Pictish people, who had been the dominant population of northern Britain throughout the Roman period and afterward, left behind carved stones of extraordinary sophistication and almost no written records in their own language, making them one of the great mysteries of early medieval Britain. What happened to them, how they were absorbed into the emerging Scottish kingdom, whether that absorption was peaceful or coercive, remains a subject of genuine historical debate that the available evidence cannot fully resolve. Wales, throughout this entire period, maintained a distinct cultural and political identity that repeatedly refused to be absorbed into whatever was happening to the east. The Welsh kingdoms, Gwynedd, Powys, Deheubarth, and others, preserved the Brittonic language that was the ancestor of modern Welsh, maintained a legal tradition traceable to the legendary lawgiver Hywel Dda in the 10th century, and produced a literary culture in Welsh that has continuous documented existence from the early medieval period to the present day. The Welsh poets of the 6th and 7th centuries, figures like Taliesin and Aneurin, produced works that survive in manuscripts written centuries later but which preserve traditions of oral poetry that reach back into the sub-Roman period, making them among the oldest vernacular literary traditions in Britain and some of the earliest voices we have from this otherwise poorly documented world. What emerges from all of this, when you step back from the individual kingdoms and battles and ecclesiastical disputes and look at the whole shape of the period, is a picture of extraordinary complexity and dynamism. Medieval Britain was not a settled place waiting for modernity to arrive. It was a world of constant movement, constant negotiation, constant cultural exchange, in which the identities that we now take as fixed, English, Scottish, Welsh, were themselves being constructed and contested and revised. The languages people spoke, the laws they lived under, the religious institutions they belonged to, the stories they told about their past, all of these were in motion, being shaped by the collision of different traditions and the decisions of people who were trying to make sense of their circumstances with the tools available to them. The stones and the manuscripts and the place names and the genetic data all tell versions of the same story, which is that the forgotten origins of medieval Britain are not really forgotten at all. They are present everywhere you know how to look for them, in the structure of the language, in the shape of the landscape, in the institutional arrangements that still organize British life in ways that trace back, through long and winding chains of consequence, to decisions made in monasteries and on battlefields and in the councils of kingdoms that most people have never heard of. The past is not behind us. It is underneath us, and the ground we stand on is made of it. That is what makes this period worth recovering and worth understanding. Not as a curiosity or as a backdrop for fantasy, but as the actual origin story of a world that still exists, still carries the marks of what happened in those centuries, still speaks languages and observes customs and inhabits institutions whose roots reach down into the sub-Roman darkness and the monastic scriptoriums and the negotiated borders of the Danelaw and the carved stones of the Picts. The forgotten origins of medieval Britain are the origins of Britain itself, and they are stranger and richer and more contested and more alive than any simplified version of the story has ever managed to convey.